Good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Daniel Medin. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the Michalski Foundation, and especially to be in the presence of Sjón. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with his work, he is an extraordinary artist, gifted in many different fields, from poetry to literature, different forms of literature, the novel, screenwriting, music, and it's exciting to be here today to talk about his most recent fiction, which has been translated into English as Red Milk, and there is an edition in French as well called Blanc comme les blés. And we'll be discussing the subject matter of it in relation to the topic of today, which has to do with democracy in danger and caring about the future. Caring about the future also, of course, involves being aware of the past. And given that this is a novel that in many respects attempts to document using different kinds of fictional devices, the lifespan of an Icelandic neo-Nazi, it's obviously a form of confrontation with the past that feels very much relevant to both the present and the future. And for this reason, maybe because as a reader, I've often associated your work with storytelling in general, and different myths and legends that have been in circulation, not just in Iceland, but in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And it feels as though in recent years, you've been preoccupied with some of the great tragic events of European history in the 20th century, right? You covered the First World War and the Spanish influenza in one of your other recent novels. Parts of Codex, which was written over different periods of time, is also preoccupied with the Second World War. And the Second World War and its aftermath seems to feel like also it weighs upon this novel. Can you say something about maybe its origin and your preoccupations? Where did this particular project come from? What was its genesis, at least for you?
Yeah, well, let me first start to say that I'm so glad to be here. I've known about this place for years. One of my earlier novels was nominated to the Michalski Prize. So I think almost at the very beginning of that prize, it was nominated by Nuruddin Farah, which was a surprise to me that he had actually read my book and liked it, but he did. And so I've been following from the distance the birth of this place, and it's amazing to finally be here and to be in a place that is so infused with love for literature and stories and our need to communicate in words to each other. And you're right, we are here because I have been doing that in books. And one of the reasons I can come up with why I have been occupied with these events of the past, and like you said, the Spanish influenza and the First World War, the Second World War, and the Holocaust, and now this book, which is about a young man who founded a neo-Nazi cell in Iceland in the late 50s. I think one of the tasks a writer can set for him or herself is to explore what in my case what he's made of, what went into making me the person I am, the writer I am, and obviously to look for what made you, you have to go to the past. And Codex 1962 is this big this big novel in 3 parts that I wrote over the span of 25 years. And it starts with a novel that takes place in the Second World War and ends with the protagonist leaving war-ridden Europe for Iceland. And that was my first, like we can say, first serious novel where I really looked at this. And I thought it would be interesting for me to look at the world that my parents were born in, you know. So instead of looking at the times and the place that I was born in, I thought, let's look at the place where my parents were born. So my parents were born in 1936 and 39, so during the Second World War. And they were coming of age, and they were children in those years in Iceland, in this place that was rather protected from the big horrid events of the Second World War. And I thought, let's look at their beginning before I get to my own beginning. And in that book, and then a later book that has the title The Whispering Muse in Icelandic, I worked with the themes of nationalistic thought, the themes of social nationalism or national socialism, Nazism, which were so predominant, obviously, in the world at the time, and were having a huge influence on the lives of people everywhere. And even in Iceland, though it was living in this isolation and rather in protection in the Second World War. I explored this ideology and its impact on the world that my parents were born into in that book, and then later in this book called The Whispering Muse. But I did it with a sort of an ironic distance, you can say. I allowed myself to look at the Icelandic Nazis, the National Socialists in Iceland, from a certain distance and with a certain irony. Because what they were doing was that they were using the flattering that they received from the German National Socialists to inflate their own egos and their own sense of worth in this world, living on a small island in the north. And this led to a general preoccupation with how people interact with what we can easily call the ideology of evil. You know, how do you interact with it? If you live in Iceland and you live at a certain distance from the true impact that this ideology is having on the lives of millions, and how a certain part of the human population was sent through hell and death at the behest of this ideology, and I'm of course talking about referring to the Holocaust. It was interesting to me how it was possible to be involved in this ideology, being so far away from the events that were actually manifesting what this ideology really was and what it would lead to. And I allowed myself to do it with irony. I'm getting there. It's and so the Icelandic Nazis that you see in Codex 1962, and the old man who is at the mercy of racial ideas in this book called The Whispering Muse, and that is a character that is actually based on my great-grandfather, who had the ideas that the superiority of the Nordic race could be explained by the fact that these people lived on fish, mostly, And Icelanders were the prime example of how amazing the human being could become because they ate so much fish. So I was looking at these racial, nationalistic ideas from this ironic distance. And when I had finished Codex 1962 in 2016, and I started reflecting on what I had done with that big work, I sort of came to the conclusion that I needed to write a book that did not let's say I needed to write a book where I went with all seriousness into the subject matter, where I did not allow myself irony, where I really tried to understand how someone could become a neo-Nazi, in this case, in the years after the Second World War, at the time of the revelation of what had really gone on in the death camps. There is the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel. You have the revelations of the Nuremberg trials, and still you could become a neo-Nazi, and you could start a neo-Nazi cell in Iceland in the late 50s. This was something I wanted to take a closer look at, and with the seriousness that I felt the victims of this ideology, they deserved one book by me where I did not have fun at the expense of the Nazis, because I thought, let's take a closer look at what this ideology is and what makes you, what draws you to it, even at the time where all the evils of that ideology had been exposed.
That's fascinating. So firstly, because it's a confirmation that you're returning to material that you had already confronted, and that there was an urgency in having to go back to it. Like writing Codex did not complete this project. And it's particularly interesting in terms of the way that you're describing that it needed to be updated, both in terms of the perspective with which you would use to describe its character, but also temporally, right? Picking a period that partly overlaps with your own childhood, right, in many respects. And so how did this person become who he was? We'll talk, I think in a moment, I would like to explore some of the relations between what might be strictly local in Iceland and the illusions of that isolation in a global world that was global before globalization. But maybe first, in terms of the character, could you tell us a little bit about neo-Nazism in Iceland? Because I think probably even the term would strike many educated people in Europe as, what? Neo-Nazis in Iceland? And you do have historical research, you've done historical research. Could you say that goes beyond family encounters or things that you might have adopted from your own experience? Could you just maybe summarize what the historical content here?
Yeah, so when I was writing the Codex, and also the book, The Whispering Muse, I had to do a research into the history of National Socialism in Iceland. And when I was doing that research, I discovered that the story didn't end with the Icelandic National Socialist Party coming to an end in 1937 or 8, when the Brits came to Iceland, or when people started reacting against them. I discovered that there was this epilogue to that story. And that was a neo-Nazi cell that was founded in 1957-58 in Reykjavik. And whenever this small group of young men, mostly, was mentioned, it was always done with sort of, it was always treated as a joke, really. Okay, there was a small group of guys who were marching with the swastika in the cemetery of Reykjavik on Hitler's birthday in 1961. Oh, what a joke, you know. And I thought, why do we treat it as a joke, even though they had their brief moment in the late 50s, early 60s? Why is it always treated as a joke? And I realized it was always treated as a joke because one of our reaction to neo-Nazism is to either belittle the people who are involved in it, or demonizing it, you know. And in Iceland, it was easier to belittle them and say they were young guys, they were just full of crazy ideas, and they did these stunts, you know, and then they just grew up and became good citizens, you know. And I thought, let's take a look at these people. Who were they? What did they actually do? Who were they connected with? And is it possible that there is a story there that resonates in our times, you know? And I discovered that the leader of this tiny cell in Iceland, he not only was incredibly well connected with the people who were at that time laying the foundation for the global neo-Nazi movement and the neo-Nazi movement as we know it today. He was instrumental in it. And I thought this is another example of Iceland being involved in things on a global scale that are completely beyond what you would think of a tiny nation up there in the north on this godforsaken rock that erupted out of the sea some millions of years ago.
But they don't print it in the tourist brochures.
No, and of course, a part of my project as a writer throughout the years has been digging into the past of Iceland and digging up the dirt, you know. So there I found a story that hadn't been told and hadn't been confronted. But it was an interesting journey because I never could. It was somehow impossible for me to go into that story and tell it. And why? Because I really didn't want to live inside the head of a neo-Nazi, you know, for too long. And it was only when I discovered that the guy who founded this neo-Nazi party, that he died at a very young age. He dies in 1962. So he dies in the year that I am born, you know. So there is a connection there, you know. I mean, I have been preoccupied with the year 1962. But anyway, this young man, this young idealistic man, he founds this neo-Nazi cell, and then he dies in 1962, just at the moment in time when the global movement is founded, when the World Union of National Socialists is founded in England, in the Cotswolds in August. And when I realized that this man had died at the moment his vision was about to become true, I understood that I had a reversed heroic journey. It's usually in films about heroes that the hero dies at the moment, you know, sacrifices himself for the great cause, reaches out with a flag and manages to put it down at the last moment, you know, and then dies, you know. And in this case, you had a person who used the last strength in his body for the most despicable cause possible. Then I thought, this is interesting. I can write about a short life dedicated to the worst cause possible, and it has all the elements of a hagiography. It has all the elements of exactly the stories Nazis and neo-Nazis are occupied with. It is the sacrifice of a young man for the cause who dies before he can see the great world of the Third Reich or the promised world of racially pure world come true. And it gave me two things. It gave me like a good frame for telling the story. I knew it would end with his death in 1962. That was important. That I realized I didn't have to live for too long in his brain, and I didn't have to be on too long a journey with him. But then I also realized that it's always easier to write about a dead Nazi than a living Nazi. So I will not spoil anything if I tell you that the book begins with his death. And because the book begins with the death of this young Nazi guy, I think we are ready to go on the more humanistic journey that I take with him for the rest of the book. Because the great task was to create a human being. I really believe that as a writer, I have the duty to create characters that are presented from a humanistic point of view. And how do you deal with someone who is a neo-Nazi, who lives for that cause, whose head is full of despicable ideas, who is organizing, putting into action things that can only lead to a worse and darker world, you know? How do you approach a character like that with the same humanistic tools that you use when you're writing, for example, the story of a queer orphaned kid who is trying to survive in Reykjavik in 1918 during the days of the Spanish influenza, like I had done before. So it's the most complicated writing I've ever done, because I had to present the life of a character that is despicable in most aspects, but I had to find a way of doing it where I would stay true to myself as a humanist. Mm. So the reason we always deal with neo-Nazis as clowns or monsters is that nobody confesses to being a clown or a monster. I mean, you don't want to be an idiot and you don't want to be a monster. So it's very easy to, when you say someone is a monster or someone is a clown, you're very like, I've got nothing in common with this person. So I had to do the same thing for this character that I do with every other character I write into being in my books. I had to look for similarities.
It's interesting because, I mean, we're dealing with, this is an issue that other writers have faced as well, like in terms of representing the banality of evil, right? And you've already answered in part one of the questions that I had in terms of why choose fiction as a vehicle to tell this particular story. But then I can't help but think of when you give this explanation of for example, a book like Jonathan Littell's Les Bienveillantes, where he's trying to inhabit the consciousness of a horrible person, right, who participates in the brutality. Or especially, in particular, Karl Ove Knausgård, who in My Struggle, which is obviously named after Hitler, in its final volume, it feels as though its impetus is a confrontation with a biography of Hitler by Ian Kershaw. And as you read this novel, it feels like Knausgård is responding against the way that Kershaw describes the childhood of Hitler, as though Hitler had been evil from the very start. It's strange because on the one hand, Knausgård is trying to demonstrate, no, Hitler was one of us. He was a human being. He became Hitler over the course of the First World War and afterwards, and there were other kind of things that, you know, that helped develop that. But other social factors, other historical factors. It's strange, though, because he's quoting instances from Hitler's childhood in the novel, which actually make you think, no, he's pretty monstrous. You know, he's absolutely has no empathy. Is unable to enter the lives of others even while he's young. But these all lead to formal questions, right? And ethical questions, I think, as well, right? While reading this novel, I was struck by the distance. You've already mentioned I didn't want to mock the character. But it seems to me also what's interesting in the way, and I'm in technical terms, the way that you represent the character is, it seems like you've also renounced interiority. Now, I've read your other fiction, you're capable of interiority, right? There's nobody who saw, of course, there are other factors to this as well, but you know, you can make people cry because by inhabiting the consciousness of somebody, and then, you know, and you have great empathy as you read it, and you enter that world. You don't do that here, and it feels as though that's intentional. And so I imagine one of the challenges is how do you make the character credible and bring him to life, but at the same time, you don't want to, you can feel that you don't want to fully enter his being.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, like I said, it was a special task in dealing with this character, because it is like it had to become clinical, you know. It's and now I'm speaking in terms that I would not use in the book. You know, when I'm talking about the book, I can talk about evil and all of those things. I did not want to do it in the book directly, but dealing with this material was in a way like dealing with a virus. It had to be very, very, very controlled, because I definitely did not want this book to become loved by neo-Nazis, saying, "Oh, here's one of us. Look at his journey. He died before he could like celebrate with the great founders of the neo-Nazi movement in England."
Between what he's saying and the things I was hearing from Le Pen in the last elections, the things that the populist movement everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is a coolness to it. There is a distance to the book. You know, there's a distance to the character. But at the same time, it is a childhood. He has a family. There is the friendly neighbor. There is the relationship with a mentally challenged brother, and things like that. You know, I mean, he's having a proper childhood. He's having a proper life like any human being. But then then his journey becomes this journey. But I don't think it's completely right that I do not allow him interiority, because there is a section of the book that is made up of letters. The letters that he writes to his mother, to his girlfriend, to his best friend, and then the letters that he's writing to the leaders of the neo-Nazi movement. And that gives us a glimpse of his mind, of his inner life. Of course, he's staging himself in the letters. He's always staging himself in the letters. When he's writing to his girlfriend, he's of course writing to his girlfriend, and he wants to be funny and clever and show a good side of himself. Also, when he's writing to his friend, he's being funny, but he's also being funny about things that maybe we shouldn't be joking about. And then when he's writing to the leaders of the neo-Nazi movement, you can see that he is writing for credit. He's writing with the purpose of getting his credits from them. And the mad thing was that when I started looking at what this guy had been doing in the late 50s and early 60s, the mad thing was that it mirrored completely what I had been doing exactly 20 years later. The only difference between his journey and my journey was that he was obsessed with National Socialism and racism, while I was obsessed with surrealism and punk and rebellion. But I had exactly the same journey, And while he was writing to the neo-Nazi leaders in the world, I was writing to the people who had been In the last group around André Breton, I was writing to them, saying, I'm a young surrealist from Iceland. I have been corresponding with this person, just so this person that I was writing to now would take me seriously. You know, and I was really trying to build up a credit within the surrealist circles. And I was publishing, self-publishing books. I was organizing events in Reykjavik. And it mirrored my journey completely. And when I realized that our journeys had been exactly the same, but with a completely different ideology, then I knew that I could write this book, you know. So, and that brought home the truth of his normalness. Because I am, of course, just a normal guy. I grow up in a normal family. And there are elements, if I look back, there are little events here and there that nudged me in the direction of becoming completely obsessed with surrealism as a teenager. I can see those moments now. There was a catalog from an exhibition that happened to come into my home, you know, and I thought, what crazy images are these, you know? And I was 8 or 9 years old. I was 12, 13 when I read translations of the Czech surrealists in Icelandic. And it was the strangest text I had read in my life. And it ignited something in my brain, you know. So there are moments in my journey that led to the fact that I am here today, the journey of literature, you know, my obsession with surrealism, my wish to reach out into the world and correspond with like-minded people. And I had this idea that, of course, you know, the world would become a much better place if everybody became a surrealist, you know, and the world would like just live by the surrealist ideals. So I had all the...
Well, art can be a form of fanaticism as well.
Yes,
right? That's
yes.
Recognizing that the patterns...
Absolutely. And starting a surrealist group in Iceland in 1979, you know, mirrored this founding of a neo-Nazi group in 1959 in Reykjavik. Obviously, there are great differences as well, you know. I mean, the big mystery to everyone when you start looking into this material is the question, how is this possible so soon after the war? How is it possible so soon after the revelations of the Nuremberg trials and then the Eichmann trial? You know, how is it possible to come to this cause and to become one of the people who want to further this cause? Yeah. Obviously, the answer is that it is possible because it never went away.
Of course.
You know, it never went away. One of the best resources I had in writing this book is the history of Nazism in Sweden by a writer called Helen Lööf. I went to that book because the guy I am writing about, his main contact at the beginning with the international neo-Nazi movement was through a Swedish man called Göran Asser Oretsson, who ran a small neo-Nazi group in Sweden and was expanding to the other Nordic countries at the time. And Helen Lööf, in her book about Nazism in Sweden, she very clearly demonstrates how the old Nazi party in Sweden, how it like just went into hiding during the war, and then just like immediately started finding new ways of existing after the war. And the crazy thing is that Göran Asser Oretsson, he laid the foundation for so many elements that are being used by mainstream populists today. So all of this comes from the 60s and was built on the original Nazi party. So it's not a question of something returning, it's a question of something coming out of hiding.
Absolutely. Maybe we could give, it would be nice to actually have a short reading from the text so that we can hear a bit of the Icelandic original. And, and I believe, and then I will read another part, the second half in the English translation. And then I think that for those who are listening in French, they will hear from the French translation publisher.
I must say, it's so strange to talk about this book. It was published in 2019 in Iceland, so just before COVID. So I have a very little experience of talking about this book in public, actually. So please forgive me if I'm going all over the place. I'm trying to find the ways of talking about it. Because the big trouble with talking about this book is that there is so little to celebrate in the story, you know. And yeah.
So much that you see outside of the story.
Yeah.
Right? So that's part of the
And there in Iceland, there was the discussion about the book was so much about if it was responsible of me to write about this character with this distance.
Without demonizing.
Without demonizing him and with this distance. And the only way I could do it was to humanize him, was to find the parallels with my own story, but also to do it very subtly, with absolute subtlety. And it is a book that you really need to read twice, at least.
And just to introduce the passage, he changes perspective throughout the book, Sjón, the author. So, and in this one we get a kind of family portrait. This is the moment when Gunnar Kampen, the protagonist, is young, and we get a sense of the environment that he's grown up in.
Erla satt við enda eldhúsborðsins og strauk þögul yfir sykurmylsnu á dúknum með fingurgómi. Þá mundi Sólveig eftir svörtu jakkafötunum sem Kíki frænka hafði skilið eftir. Gunnar gæti fernst í nýjum fötum eins og skólabræður hans. Hann hlyti að vera orðinn nógu stór í þau núna langimtis sem hann væri. Málinu var bjargað. Sólveig leit á Gunnar og beið eftir samþykki hans. Hann yppti öxlum. Hún hvessti brúnir og nikkaði í átt að móður þeirra. Gunnar horfði á móti og myndaði hljóðlaust orðið hvað. Hann sneri sér með spurnarsvip að Astrid. Hún kleip hann í hnéð undir borðinu. Góð hugmynd, ha? Gunnar roðnaði. Jú. Erla rétti úr sér í sætinu en Sólveig var fyrri til að standa á fætur. Vertu bara hjá Herði, mamma, við finnum þau. Hörður birtist í eldhúsdyrunum, 7 ára að vexti, 4 ára í anda. Ég vil koma með. Blokkaríbúðin á Asparmel var afar lítil miðað við húsið sem Páll Kampen hafði byggt fjölskyldu sinni á Mánavallagötu. En öllum bar saman að kjallarageymslan væri góð. Eftir nokkra leit fundust jakkafötin í pappakassa undir heildarútgáfu af verkum Björnsterne Björnsson og gömlum dagatölum frá Eimskipafélaginu. Eitt þeirra fékk Hörður að taka með sér. Hann valdi árið sem hann fæddist og systkinin hældi honum fyrir valið. Fremst í dagatalinu var síða með ljósmyndum úr starfi skipafélagsins, prentuð með bláu á þunnan gulleitan pappír. Og þótt þær væru jafn óskýrar og allt annað sem prentaðir í þeim lit á muskulegan grunn, mátti á einni myndana greina starfsmenn tækjalagarsins saman í hóp framan við lagarskemmuna. Þar var Páll faðir þeirra annar frá hægri. Sólveig, Astrid og Gunnar þögnuðu. Orðalaust tók Astrid dagatalið úr höndum litla bróður síns og reif úr því myndasíðuna. Hún rétti herðið aftur, braut síðuna saman og stakk í vasa á pilsi sínu.
The suit turned out to be a little on the large side, and not exactly in line with the fashions of the day. But with a bit of skill, it should be possible to take it in and iron flat the marks where something had previously been sewn onto it. Solveig, who was in Svavar, and Ebba's dance troupe, had grown adept at unpicking seams, taking up, taking in, and ironing, since every time new members were admitted to the group, the costumes had to be altered to fit them. Gunnar already had a decent shirt and a pair of shoes and would be permitted to buy himself a tie at the gentleman's outfitters. The plan put forward by the vicar was for Erla to hold the reception in the church hall together with 2 other widows whose children were being confirmed at the same time, but the sisters wouldn't hear of it, saying that there was more than enough to remind their mother of her loss without this to add insult to injury. "We'll just have to squeeze up," was all the answer Reverend Asger got when he tried to talk them round. On the evening of his confirmation, Gunnar sat on his bed, examining his haul of gifts. He was in his shirt sleeves, had taken off his tie and undone his top button. The black jacket lay on the bed beside him. There was a set of pens, an envelope containing 150 kroner, a copy of Hallgrimr Pettersson's Hymns of Passion, an atlas with up-to-date borders, a penknife, and 3 volumes of the legendary Sagas of the North. The sound of voices floated up from the floor below, where, in the bedroom of the 2-room flat, Erla was settling herder for the night. Gunnar had a room to himself in the attic. Although not large, it could accommodate a daybed, a desk, and a bookcase, as well as a wardrobe that he referred to as the coffin. There was a skylight that could be opened in the sloping room, and if he stood on a chair, he could see right over the center of town to Faxafløy Bay. The flat was home to his mother, Herder, and him. Solveig now lived in the Hlidar area with her boyfriend, a radical history student called Einar, and Astrid rented a place with another girl from her class at the women's college. It was thanks to this little garret that Gunnar was able to continue living at home with his mother. I'll stop a little bit early there, but you just get a sense of quotidian life within this particular family and its different characters of confirmation, the clothes, the kind of, and the environment within which he grows up, which includes, of course, the volume of the sagas.
Yes, and of course, the crazy thing is, and this is not very subtle, but you might recognize it on the second reading, that the suit he is getting confirmed in is a discarded uniform of an SS man that was brought to Iceland by his niece, or by his aunt. So this
Norway, right?
From Norway. So she brings this uniform of an SS officer with her. It's her former lover. She's escaping Norway because she has been harassed for being the girlfriend of a Nazi officer in Oslo. And on her way to Argentine, she stops over in Reykjavik and she leaves this uniform behind. They are very poor when Gunnar is getting confirmed, so they take the Nazi uniform and they modify it, and he's confirmed in a Nazi officer's uniform. So all of these elements, show how present the Second World War was, how present, how close the contact with the Nazis is, and how it is carried on, in a new form. So when they have stripped all the badges of the uniform and they have modified it for Gunnar, he is confirmed in this. And then, of course, he gets like one of the confirmation gifts that you did not mention because it comes a little bit later, is a book on insects that used to belong to Ernst Jünger.
Ernst Jünger, yeah, Leipzig, 1930.
So there is a lot of little hints throughout the book, or a lot of little elements like this in his environment that show that the environment is completely saturated with influences from the recent past and from Nazism, and how Nazism continues in the little things while it's hiding.
Well, I think of the line by Faulkner, the past, it's not even past. Right?
Yes, yes.
And that's very clearly present here. I want to take advantage of your presence to ask you about another new work before we open up to questions from the audience. There's a book of Sagas on the bed. We've been talking about the way that, growing up in Iceland and certainly being receptive to literature, that you almost absorb this literary history. And I mentioned in my introduction that you're not just a novelist and not just a poet, but that you work in different areas as well. And while I was taking the metro to my plane, to the train to Switzerland, of course, there were advertisements all over in the metro about the Northmen. And so there's a film that you collaborated on and that you helped to write. I wonder if you could say something that is being released right now, which is based or inspired by all of the stuff that you've absorbed, right? It's an invented story that's within the spirit of that period, about Norsemen. And maybe can you say something just about like using this older material, but within a completely modern idiom, which is to say a visual one.
Yeah.
Your experience in trying to adapt that for cinema.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this also touches on the book, because one of the things that I had to deny myself using in the book is the mythical elements, and is the Icelandic sagas, and is the Nordic heritage, because all of that was hijacked by the National Socialists, and so many of the wonderful things from the Nordic culture were disfigured by its use. In the Third Reich, the runes, the names of their battalions and everything was disfigured and had to be rehabilitated after the war, and is still being rehabilitated. So this material, the Icelandic sagas, are of course our pride and are the great heritage that we built our literature on, and is our claim at the seat of the seat at the table of civilizations, you can say. And the sagas are these amazing narratives written in the Icelandic language in the 13th century. And as an Icelandic writer, this is something that you grow up with. You grow up with awareness of these books. You read the key works in school, and you learn how to appreciate it. And the amazing thing is that we read it in the 13th century original. That is the unbroken link we have to these stories. And yes, this film has just come out. It's called The Northman. It is a story that takes place in 875 to 914. And which is the time of the settlement of Iceland. And I worked on it with an American filmmaker called Robert Eggers, and he asked me to write the script with him. But the basis of the story is the story of Amleth, which is a story that was kept alive in Iceland, both through epic poetry, and there was a saga, there's a lost saga, the saga of Amleth. And that is a story that Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish historian, wrote in his Story of the Danes in the 13th century. And that story inspired Hamlet by Shakespeare. So Amleth becomes Hamlet. And when we were looking for a story to tell in our film, we went for a saga that had been lost. And we try to reimagine it. And we go into that world and we try to stay true to the worldview of people before Christianity came to the north. So it's an absolutely pagan worldview. It's a world where vengeance is the rule and not the exception, and vengeance is the only way of keeping your family's honor alive and securing an honor for yourself and possibly a place in the great afterlife of Valhalla or Valhall, where you can fight for eternity. You fight during the day, and all of those who die in battle during the day, they rise at night and celebrate and start the fight over again in the morning. So that is the Viking paradise. It's an endless battle, endless bloodshed. And it was amazing to work on this film because we worked with archaeologists and anthropologists and medieval scholars in recreating that world. But what happens is that, of course, we are modern people, you know, so we need to tell the story with the language of the cinema. And it was a tricky path to follow, to stay true to the worldview of the characters, while at the same time exposing what we can only call let's say what we can say is the unacceptable aspects of it, you know. But we also celebrated the culture, the beauty of it, and all of that. But it's a cruel story, and our main character, Amleth, who experiences as a young boy that his uncle kills his father and marries his mother. That's a story that Shakespeare took. And then he returns as a grown man to avenge his father and try to stop this travesty of this incestuous marriage between his uncle and his mother. Yeah, that is the story. And
it's lovely.
It's all done with the tools of cinema, but it's a Hamlet that has no time for contemplation. He has no time for doubt. There is one moment in the whole story where he's faced with a choice. It comes at the very last moment. Then he has his to be or not to be moment. And because he's a Viking, he says, I choose both.
It's funny, too. It's a nice way to wrap up the conversation on Red Milk as well, because Red Milk is about a character who believes a lie of total isolation, of Icelandic, you know, of some kind of authentic origin that hasn't been tainted by any other culture. And the fact is, stories circulate even when you're on an island. There is a way that they come in and they go out as well. And this is a great example of that, even just in terms of the history, that this is a story about a Norseman, but also, of course, you end up, it has all of Shakespeare within it.
Yes, and then of course, one of the things we were very careful with in the film is the casting of the film. Because the Nordic people you see in the film they are not all blonde and blue-eyed. They look as different as we do here in this auditorium, and even more different. And you have different cultures presented and hinted at, you know. There are Irish Christians. There is Slavic people there. There is the great gift the king gives to his son when he returns from his mission is an Arabic talisman, and he carries this Arabic talisman around his neck through his whole life, you know. So the cultures are coming. We were very careful with not presenting a homogeneous culture, because
which would be false, because it's not like that in the sagas either.
No, that is the big lie that was projected onto this historical material and to our cultural heritage. And we are discovering more and more how much the sagas are the creation of a multicultural situation. They are written, they are about the pagan settlement of Iceland. They are written in Catholic Iceland. They are written by people who bring learning from Europe at the time, and the world that they're presenting is a world that is made up of Irish people, Icelanders, and people are traveling all over the world. There is an Icelander buried in the hills of Kiev. Thorvald the much traveled. There was, he is buried there, you know. And when I was in Kiev 4 years ago, I visited the catacombs, you know, because it's possible that he is somewhere in the catacombs of Kiev, you know. And it's very interesting now with the invasion of Ukraine and the horrors there, that this has led Icelanders to remember the old relationship between our country and Kiev and Ukraine. And it was not only bloody. It's bloody in the film. It's bloody in the film, but it was not only bloody. And we have a word for Kiev in Icelandic, which is Kænugarður, and which is the old Nordic word for Kiev. And when Zelensky addressed the Icelandic parliament last week, he used the word Kænugarður as a recognition of this old 1,000-year-old relationship between our countries. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I think we only have time for one question, but I do want to state there are copies of his books, several of them, in multiple languages upstairs, and I strongly commend you to take advantage of that, and Sjón will be here to sign your copy and dedicate it. And so if there's a question you have that you haven't had the opportunity to ask now, please take advantage of it in the very near future. Yes?
Thanks very much. That was really interesting, and I'm particularly pleased to hear about the power of fish, and everybody in this region will be pleased. And I'll be having filet de perche this evening for dinner. Daniel, you mentioned the banality of evil, and I just wondered, you know, between the clown and the monster, did you find that concept helpful as you were looking into this? And Hannah Arendt and her work on all of that, and because we're only allowed one question, I'm interested. You know, the Italy and Germany both had the threat of communism in. If you look at the origins of Mussolini and Hitler, and it wasn't a made-up threat. There was the possibility of revolution, but what are these guys worrying about? I mean, you know, communism's dead now. You know, the threat to Iceland in the 50s and 60s wasn't that intense, I guess. You know, what are they really worried about? It's difficult to understand in the same context as the origins of fascism in the 20s and 30s.
Well. They were sensing the radical worldview of women's liberation and desegregation and all of that, you know, and they were also driven by a sense of duty towards Germany, you know. And what they experienced as the humiliation of Germany at the end of the Second World War, you know, was something that drove them, because they felt they owed it to Germany to keep the flame alive, you know, and that great project had been stopped in its tracks, you know. So it was a continuation of that project, but then also. But of course, this is the Cold War, so the threat of communism is still very present. But at the same time, they were against NATO, you know, because they saw NATO as like an alliance that was really meant to undermine the possibility of Germany becoming great again, you know. So it doesn't take much for a neo-Nazi to find a good reason for being. But the banality of evil was definitely a concept that was inspiring to me, as well as the amazing poem by Leonard Cohen about Eichmann, It's a masterful poem. I was tempted to quote it here, and I was tempted to quote Hannah Arendt here in the book, but I thought the book is already a quote, and is a big quote, and so much inspired by it. But I think, people are always saying, well, how can we deal with neo-Nazism? How do we deal with it? Because obviously, discussion is not possible, because you can't have a discussion with a person who, in the end, is not going to listen to you, and who has as an ultimate goal your destruction, And I think the only revenge, the only proper attack is what I propose in this book, which is admitting that they are normal people, that they are as insignificant and significant as the rest of us, that they do not come from a super race, they do not come, they have not connected with higher power, And the worst thing you can tell a neo-Nazi is that he's normal. Yeah.
We have time for another question?
They feed on this. They feed on the dramatization. And it's so interesting that every commentator, every newspaper fails. Whenever there is a news item on neo-Nazis, it's always, now we're talking about neo-Nazis. But if they're talking about radical feminist performance artists, it's like, radical feminist performance artists, But it's like, now we're talking about something special. We're talking about neo-Nazis. And the guy in the book, he says, it doesn't matter how many times they ridicule us, because they were ridiculed whenever they were mentioned in the Icelandic press. He said, every time they call me Little Hitler in the press and they make fun of me, I get 20 new recruits. Because we are special. And everybody wants to belong to something special.
And there's an uncomfortable resonance as an American to read something like that when you're aware of the far right and the media.
Yeah.
And the way that they've interacted.
Yeah. So my proposal is that we all become surrealists or radical feminist performance artists rather than neo-Nazis. We use the energy for that. Yes. Yeah. Okay,
Thank
sorry.
you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can we have a round of applause for Sjón?
Thank you. Thank you.